Our scripture this morning comes from the 21st chapter of the Gospel according to John, verses 1 through 19. After these things, and by these things it's Jesus appearing to the disciples in the upper room, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. And Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. And they said to him, we will go with you. They went out and they got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, children, have you no fish? He said to them, cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. The disciple that Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and he jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. And when they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and some bread. And Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, come now, have breakfast. Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. And when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And Peter said to him, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my lambs. A second time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter said to him, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And Jesus said to him, tend my sheep. Then Jesus said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter felt hurt because he'd said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go. He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. And after this, Jesus said to him, follow me. This is the word of the Lord for the people of God. And while I am remembering fish, Saturday evening there is a fish fry at the Fife to benefit the food pantry because we have sheep to feed. And we can do it through the food pantry. See how I did that? I waited until just the right moment so you will remember it. Saturday evening, fish fry. Because fish and sheep tending, next time we have communion, you think we should have bread and fish? That'll smell good, won't it, by the time church starts? You know, we're moving through Eastertide, sort of celebrating the wonder of the resurrection, the miracle of seeing Jesus raised from the dead. And this morning we find the disciples sort of at loose ends, and they decide to do what? Go fishing. Well, they weren't really fishing because they weren't catching any fish. They were in a boat. But the disciples have seen Jesus after his crucifixion twice now, but they still don't seem to have any idea what this is supposed to mean for them. These weeks between Easter Sunday and Pentecost, these are the weeks where we talk about the church, the calling of the church into existence. So these disciples, they know Jesus is alive, but they don't know what it means. They've broken bread with him. They've seen the wounds in his hands and his side. But when Jesus isn't right there with them, they don't seem to have any idea what to do. I suspect we'd be the same way. But this is kind of an odd story altogether. The other gospel writers take this story and they break it in two. You've got the breakfast on the beach, and then you've got this feed my sheep thing. But John put them together. And John's gospel is not exactly a narrative storytelling sort of gospel. So the fact that he tells this story and puts these two things together may be worth noticing. I did a lot of reading preparing for this because it is an interesting passage. And this passage has stumped scholars. Why did John do this? But there was one article that I think the writer, she might have been onto something. Jesus has risen from the dead. He's come, shared a meal with them, and he's gone. So Peter says, I'm going fishing. And the rest of them say, we're going too. So off they go. They go back to the life and the jobs that they had before they knew Jesus. They were pretty good at it, apparently, because Peter had his own boat, his own house. And in those days, owning anything meant you were fairly well off, fairly upper middle class anyway. A lot of these self-help classes and books that you read say that when you're under stress and you don't know what to do, you do what you know. So this is what they were doing. They went fishing. They were relying on their instincts of what they could do well. They got up, headed for the sea, picked up their fishing nets. They have been face to face with the risen Christ twice. But they still can't figure out what comes next. So they move backwards into what they know best, the fishing boat. And then they don't catch fish, and then they do catch fish. And finally, after they've had all the fish and they've eaten a little breakfast, Jesus says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, well, of course I do. You know I love you. I love you more than anything. And Jesus asked him 3 times. And Peter affirms it 3 times. And the fact that Peter was hurt the 3rd time that Jesus asked is probably worth noticing, because the 3rd time that someone asked him on Good Friday night, did he love Jesus? He said no 3 times. So this sort of washes out those 3 denials by 3 times saying, I love you, I love you, I love you. And then Jesus says something really strange. If you love me, go feed my sheep. They're beside a lake. They're eating fish. They smell like fish. There's fish all around them. There's 153 fish laying there. And suddenly, Jesus says, go feed my sheep. What sheep? There are no sheep. Okay, that's easy, Jesus. We'll feed your sheep just as soon as we find some. We're fishermen. The likelihood of us running into sheep, pretty slim. There are no sheep here. If they show up, though, we'll take care of them. So a few years ago, I'm in this meeting in Seattle with a group of people who care very deeply about living out faith in really interesting ways. And one of the women that was in that meeting told about her experience in a group that went twice a year to a Benedictine retreat in Indiana. And in all the silence and in all of the yard work that they were doing, she learned from them an idea of radical hospitality. We are a hospitable people. We have food waiting downstairs for us and anyone who wants to join us. We are very friendly, open people. But what she was talking about was a kind of hospitality that has nothing to do with food. Indeed, instead, it's a hospitality that every time you see a person, you see Christ. It doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter when you are. Every person you see Christ superimposed over top of them. I don't know if you were here for the installation service, but my friend Sandra drove her car and parked it right in front of the church. And I had her do that on purpose because I wanted to make sure that as many people who could see that car did see that car. It's a standard Toyota RAV4, but it's got a very interesting paint job on it. It's got a lot of sheep on it. And there are plaid sheep and there are purple sheep and there's a denim sheep because she's sort of a denim freak. And there are all sorts of colors of sheep and shapes of sheep. And the back wheel cover says, feed 'em. When Sandra sees a person, she sees a vision of Christ, but she sees them in the vision of sheep. Her last name is Shepherd, that helps. She lives out that notion of hospitality that says, if you love me, feed my sheep, and my sheep are everywhere. The passage that's in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus says, if you've done it for the least of these, you've done it for me. Jesus in that passage mentions ways of caring for people that include visiting them in prison, feeding them when they're hungry, binding up their wounds when they're hurt, to be the one who picks up your enemy from the ditch, binds up the wounds, and then takes them off to find and pay for better care than you can deliver yourself. To be hospitable means to welcome every person in as they are Christ, creating new things from and in our community. Hospitality is not manners or politeness. It's actually going out and finding the needs that need to be met. And we do it for no reason other than the fact that we want to see more Christ. We love Jesus by loving people the way Jesus loved people. There's an old hymn that says there's no other way to do it but to trust and obey. We trust Jesus enough to obey by welcoming people, and in doing so we get to see more Jesus, giving us greater ability to trust so that we can keep obeying, so that we can see more Jesus, so that we can love and trust and obey. It's a big old circle. It keeps moving. So anyway, I'm talking to this woman in this meeting about this Benedictine retreat where they learned to see Christ in other people. And in the midst of all this conversation, it was brought up another Greek word from which we get our word hospitality is xenophilia. Went this weekend to see the new sequel to My Big Fat Greek Wedding. So if you have ever seen either of those movies, you know every English word comes from a Greek word. Xenophilio. Xeno meaning stranger, philio meaning love. So it's love of the stranger. That's what hospitality means. It's a huge concept in the Old Testament. We leave it out a lot. But the prophets are always talking about loving and welcoming the stranger. This hospitality, this going out and finding. This is a big overarching theme in Scripture. The love and care of the strangers, the ones who are on the margins. These are the people Jesus sought out, the sinners, the drunkards. Those are the people that need our hospitality. So this morning, this passage of a breakfast on the beach and a feeding my sheep is not two stories. It's one story. It's not a fish story and a sheep story. It's one story with one message. So you got these guys on a boat that come up with nothing. These are not first-time fisher people. This is how they make their living. But they just keep fishing and fishing. Same side of the boat every time. Continuing to catch nothing. They were okay because they were fishing. They had no intention of catching fish, and that meant that they just kept using the same side of the boat they'd always used because who would ever need to change? That's the way we've always done it. Besides, if there's no fish on this side of the boat, there's no fish on that side of the boat, right? We've always done it that way. It's always the way that works. And then Jesus shows up and says, try the other side. Well, then you got to haul the nuts in. You got to switch them over. Everybody's got to change places. You got to throw them back out again. It's a lot of trouble. But they caught fish, lots of fish, more fish than they knew what to do with. John says there were 153 fish. I don't know what that means, but apparently it's a lot because he was astonished that it didn't break the net. So then they have all these fish, more fish than they can eat. They have a little breakfast. They're having their second cup of coffee, and Jesus says, "Do you love me? Really?" And Jesus says, "Prove it by doing this. Feed my sheep." Peter says, "Fine. There are no sheep here, so I can easily feed your sheep. We only have fish." And that, I think, is the point of the story. Jesus asked him to do something that he could not see how to do. There are no sheep on that shore. There are only fish. And the only people who are on the shore are the people who are already full of fish. They don't need to be fed. So when Jesus tells Peter to go out and feed his sheep, I think what he was saying was, take this fish and go find some people who need to eat this fish because they're hungry. Don't stick around here on the shore. I know that you fish for a living. But Jesus promised that they would no longer catch fish, but that they would fish for people. And Jesus says the equivalent of, I've given you the fish. Go find the people. Go find my sheep and feed them with the gifts I have given you. Feed my sheep. If you love me, you will feed my sheep. If you love me, you'll find my sheep. If we love Jesus, we have to love people the way Jesus loves people. There simply is no other way but to trust that and obey that. And what does it look like? It comes down to a choice. We can go fishing, get in our familiar boat, do our familiar things, do things we've always done the way we've always done them. Whether we get new results or not, that's really not important. We're doing it. We're working. We're doing what we're called to do, being who we are. We cast our nets, we stay in the boat, we might get a fish now and then, and we get excited, and that keeps us fishing because we get one or two fish. But the other choice is this: we can hear the voice of Jesus saying, we got plenty of fish. Go find some sheep. There are lots of churches who are having services this morning just like we are, and I expect in a lot of them there aren't as many people in their pews as there are in ours, and we have space for more. And most of these churches have a wish for more people in their pews, and the reasons for wanting more people in their pews are as different as the number of churches there are. I actually talked to one church who had a specific number that they wanted more. They wanted 25 more families because that's what it needed. That's what they assumed they needed to make their budget every year. They didn't want any more, just 25 new families so they could meet the budget. But people want more people in their church. We want to grow. We want to be robust. And they can't figure out how to get those people there. Some churches, they say, well, we need families with young children. That will fix us. And some churches, it's, well, we just need a pastor who'll go out and visit. That will fix us. Or maybe we need, well, I don't know what we need, but we need something. What if, instead of trying to figure out how to get more people in here, we actually went out looking for people who needed something from us? What if rather than waiting for sheep to come to a feast that we lay out, which is not to say we should not enjoy the one laid out downstairs, but what if we packed up a feast sometime and took it out, looking for sheep? I don't know what sheep would look like. I don't know what a feast for sheep looks like. But here's what I am sure of. If we were to try that, it'd probably drive us all nuts. Because that's the problem with sheep hunting. There's sheep. I don't know, but any of you raise sheep? They are not the smartest animals God put on earth. They do, however, have a mind of their own. Sheep are frustrating. The fact that Jesus chose sheep as the metaphor for who we're supposed to be out looking for is really annoying. Feeding sheep is neither easy nor our first choice, but it is what Jesus said, feed my sheep. Jesus wants us to define hospitality as more than just good manners, but to love the people we don't know yet. And he wants us to extend it beyond the definition extend the definition of sheep herding from tending into actually going out and looking for sheep to tend. This is new. This is risky. This is unpredictable kinds of ways to think about these things. But that's the problem with Christ. He shows up in places where you are neither expecting him, ready for him, and always, usually, not prepared to hear what he's got to say. Historically, when Christ works, it's not popular. It's not easy. But we do serve a risen, living, working Lord. One who meets us and feeds us, nurtures us, and then asks us hard questions. Do you love me? A risen Lord who encourages us to move out of the comfortable places that we like to cast our nets and move into new territories. It's a lot to take in. It's a lot to think about. But what would it look like if we were sheep tending the sheep that we sought out? If we took our fish out of here looking for fields of sheep, I don't know what it would look like either. Probably wouldn't be nearly as much fun. But we would see Jesus. And together, that's more than enough reason to go fishing and sheep tending, I would think. During this season of Easter, we have been affirming what we believe by using portions of the Confession of Belhar. So let us now stand, since we're going to stand and sing in just a moment, and affirm what we believe by saying together the words that we find in the bulletin. We believe that God's life-giving word and spirit has conquered the powers of sin and death, and therefore also of irreconciliation and hatred, bitterness and enmity. That God's life-giving word and spirit will enable the church to live in new obedience, which can open new possibilities of life for society and the world. Let us continue our worship by turning to hymn 422 and singing together, God, whose giving knows no ending.